So a very warm welcome from me to our talk today, depending on where you're joining us from. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL, University College London, and I'm also the director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established in memory of the late British historian, to whom I bear no relation, as I frequently repeat, but for those of you who've not heard that before. Sir Martin was, of course, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill. And in addition to that, he published many dozens of books on a very wide range of topics, including the world wars, the 20th century, and of course, the history of Israel, the Holocaust, the history of the modern Jewish experience. And our aim at the center is really perpetuating Sir Martin's legacy and his particular skill. We aim to make the best historical research accessible to a very broad, non-academic public. And in addition to the kind of public program you're attending today, we also work a lot with secondary school teachers and students to provide resources and lessons drawing on the most recent academic scholarship and on primary source materials in order to help them inform their teaching. And in January, we're going to be rolling out some teacher training and resources relating to modern Jewish history. So if you have any teachers in your orbit, particularly in the United Kingdom, please do encourage them to look at our free resources. A small reminder that as we are a charity, and a very little charity at that, we really rely on your donations so that we can keep all of our events free at the point of access and reach a very wide audience. So any contributions that you wish to make are always very gratefully received, and it's very easy to donate on our website. Our speaker tonight is Professor Derek Penslar, who is really one of the leading historians of the modern Jewish experience, and especially of Zionism and modern Israel. I invited Professor Penslar several months ago to talk about his new book, Zionism, An Emotional State, which tells the history of Zionism not through the lens of political institutions or ideologies, but rather, as its title suggests, through the lens of emotions. And of course, the horrific events of the past few weeks have really reinforced, I think, how crucial an emotional perspective is for understanding the Zionist project, both then and now. So I feel especially honored to have you here with us today, Derek, to help us clarify and explore the current crisis, although he will be giving a broader talk that will also touch on the current crisis. Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. He's also taught at Indiana University, the University of Toronto, and at Oxford University, where he was the inaugural holder of the Stanley Lewis Chair in Modern Israel Studies. He has published very widely in the field of modern Jewish history. His most recent books are Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, which was published in 2020, and the book I just mentioned, Zionism, An Emotional State, which was published in 2023. And Penslar is currently writing a global history of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which I'm sure some will be interested to question you about at the end of the talk today. So as usual, the talk will be about 40 to 45 minutes. And after that, we will have plenty of time for your comments and questions. And Professor Penslar has very generously said that he's happy to stay on a little longer than normal. Normally, I'm very efficient about finishing our talks on the hour, but we will stay on a little longer for another 10 or 15 minutes if there are additional questions to be answered. And the title of Professor Penslar's talk today is Zionism and Emotion, From Love to Anguish. Professor Penslar.
Hey, whoops. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you, Shirley. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity. I do wish it were better circumstances. We're in a very tough situation right now, and it's probably not going to get any better soon, but at least we can try to sort of stand above it and try to understand at least one aspect of what is happening and why. And I admit this is only one aspect. I'm sure there'll be many other questions. What I want to talk about now is about how the way that Jews have felt about Israel, and we could talk in the questions and answer about non-Jews and their feelings about Israel. It's a different topic. How Jews have related to Israel, not through rational calculation, but through emotions. And that's not true only for Jews and their relationship with Zionism. It's true for nationalist movements in general. Nationalist movements are are based on group feelings rather than cold or pragmatic ideologies. And it's interesting that historians of the modern world, and particularly people who work on nationalisms, don't really talk enough about emotion. The fact is that all of us feel emotions as individuals. Emotions are actually a very hard thing to define, but they have something to do with the regulation of how much or how little we want something when you think about it. An emotion like fear or anger or hatred, these are emotions that suggest that you are not going to get something that you want, or that you had it and it was taken away, or you're afraid it will be taken away. And then there are emotions like hope and pride and love that are positive emotions that have to do somehow or another with the attainment of something that you love. And when these individual emotions that we all feel, right, every day we feel such things, when they get scaled up to the level of a collective, a nation, a people, these are called political emotions. The feeling that your well-being is dependent on that of some larger and abstract entity. Political emotion can apply to all kinds of groups. It can apply to a state, or it can apply to simply an informal group. So one scholar who's written about this, William Reddy, talks about how states create a certain way of feeling. They try to instill that into the population. There are other historians like Barbara Rosenwein who's talked about groups of people who are united by common feelings of love or hatred. You know, think about people who support a football team, for example, as being an emotional community. And then social movements, labor movements, political movements, Zionism as a political movement, they also create emotional bonds. If any of you watching, I see we have 92 people here. So if any of the 92 people, if you were ever in a Zionist youth group or some sort of a Zionist organization, you can think about the social bonds and the emotions that were forged by these organizations. We talk about Zionism in emotional terms because what is Zionism but a form of desire? A desire for a homeland for Jews, either in all of or part of the biblical land of Israel. It's very much similar to other forms of nationalism that developed around the same time that Zionism did. And so, of course, Zionism is going to be filled with political emotion because all nationalist movements are. Now, the question, though, is what's the baseline emotion for Zionism? What's the most important feeling behind Zionism? I think all too often we make the mistake in that we say that what really underlies Zionism is fear. Jews are persecuted. Jews are victims of anti-Semitic hatred of various forms. And so Jews needed to create a land of their own where they could be free. And there's something to that. But, you know, in the early 1900s, there was a mass migration of Jews from Europe, something like 2.5 million Jews from the 1880s to 1920. And of those 2.5 million Jews, about 3% wound up in Eretz Israel, 3% wound up in Palestine, 97% wound up somewhere else. Because if Jews are afraid, or if they want economic opportunity, they, by and large, they didn't go to Palestine or to the land of Israel. They went to North America, or they went to Latin America. Some, like my family, went to the UK. They went from Lithuania from northern Poland to London, which is where my grandmother grew up, in Hackney. So, you know, if all that's motivating you is fear, there's lots of places to go until the mid-1920s, when the Americans essentially closed off migration to people from Eastern and Southern Europe. And that's precisely when Jewish migration to Palestine began to grow, was when the gates got shut elsewhere. So sure, fear or a desire for a better life had something to do with Zionism. But when Zionism was first founded, even before Theodor Herzl created the Zionist organization, there was a movement in the 1880s, largely in Russia, but all over the world, called Chibat Zion, which means the love of Zion. And the very first groups that created Jewish colonies, agricultural colonies, in Palestine that sent many Jews to Jaffa, where they became merchants and teachers and the like. These people called themselves lovers of Zion, Chobavei Tzion. It was really love. And even before the Chobavei Tzion, one member of the Chobavei Tzion, the great German historian Heinrich Gretz, German Jewish historian, was clearly a man filled with love of the land of Israel. He went to Eretz Israel in 1871, and he thought it was absolutely beautiful. And he wrote a few pages about the beauty of the land of Israel in the first volume of his 11-volume History of the Jews. And then in the 1890s, he created an abridged version that was very popular, and he moved the material on Eretz Israel from kind of the middle of the second chapter to the very beginning of the book. So if you opened this book, and like every educated Jewish home in Europe had this book, this is what you would see. It begins with this beautiful description of the land of Israel, filled with gentle beauty, with the murmuring sea, regular rainfall, luxuriant fertility, little fog, clear air, and all of it having an edifying and moralizing and spiritual effect on the population. This is very much the language of Romantic nationalism. Czech nationalists at the time, or Polish or Ukrainian nationalists, they always sang about the natural beauty of the land, the rivers, the lakes, the trees, but you can see it also has a spiritual dimension. Right? And this really, I think, is the baseline emotion of Zionism is love and also hope. Hope for redemption, as in the Zionist, well, he wasn't really a Zionist, but he was a very passionate poet, Naftali Herz Imber, who wrote a poem in 1878 called Our Hope, Tikvatenu, which eventually became the Zionist national anthem. And again, there's no fear in that poem. It's all about yearning and hope to be returned to the land of Israel. So again, these are the kind of dominant emotions early in the Zionist movement. There's different kinds of love. You know, the word love can mean everything from the love of a parent for a child, or a child for a parent, to friendship, deep friendship, or the love of God, or erotic love. The Greeks refer to eros, philia, friendship, storge, which is parents and children, and agape, spiritual love. The love in the early Zionist movement incorporated all kinds. So there was the kind of love that you might have for a parent, this beautiful Zionist song from the 1880s and 90s. This was Herzl's favorite Zionist hymn. There where the slender cedar kisses the clouds and where the Jordan's rapids flow, there where my father's ashes rest, the earth hath drunk the blood of Maccabees, this precious realm on the blue sea coast, my dear beloved fatherland. This kind of love was just ubiquitous in the Zionist movement. I'm not going to play the song right now. But the love could also be erotic. And the Zionist movement had a very strong dose of erotic love. Here's a poem by a Russian Jewish poet, Menachem Mendel Dolitsky. This was a very popular poem in the late 1800s, filled with love, kind of a sickly, almost decadent, but erotic love. Zion, my perfect one, Zion, my dear one, my soul longs for you from afar. I will not forget you, Zion. I will not forget you, O perfect one, my perfect one. And when I die, my lips will be keening for you, O my beauty in my grave. It's a very mournful kind of love. But this was a very popular poem, as was a much happier poem he wrote about Zion. This was a poem that was extremely popular among the early Zionist settlers, which is it's erotic in a different way, but it's directed towards a mother, which makes it a little creepy. But arise, O aged mother, we have returned to you, entwining in your soil. We have brought building tools, spades in our hands to open the furrows. receive, beloved mother, your immortal sons, remove the garment of captivity and desire them, for they are your children. I mean, there's a very kind of a mix of different kinds of love here. It's very, very powerful. So the desire for love is, I think, a very important baseline emotion for Zionism, much more than fear. Another is the desire for honor, the desire for honor and dignity, for Jews to be able to sort of stand up straight and tall, be proud of themselves as Jews. Here we have a probably lesser known figure, but a very important figure in early Zionism, a rabbi in the German Baltic, who wrote a pamphlet in 1883 about what we would call today Zionism. And he wrote, if the Gentiles can't love us, at least they should have to respect us. And the idea that a Jewish state would give the Jews, it would win respect for them in the world, that they would have a nation state like everybody else, like the Czechs wanted, or the Poles wanted, or the Ukrainians wanted. So honor, to be able to stand up straight and be proud of yourself as a Jew. And this was very important to the founder of the Zionist organization, Theodor Herzl, who more than anything else was interested in making Jews proud. Yes, he was interested in saving them physically as well, but he was very, very devoted to the concept of Jews, bowing without subservience and standing tall without truculence. His novel Old New Land actually ends with a scene in a rebuilt Jewish temple. They don't do animal sacrifice. It actually feels like a cathedral on the inside. And the narrator of the book talks about how the Jews now are in a land where they can be honorable and they have dignity. So these are very important early themes in Zionism. So these are the baseline emotions then. Fear, to be sure, but really love, spiritual love, parental love, erotic love, and a desire for dignity, human dignity. Now, there's an emotional transformation of Zionism, though, in the 1940s, because Zionism in the UK, and especially in the United States, was really a minority movement. Most Jews in the world were not Zionists in the time of Herzl, or the 20s or the 30s. During the Second World War, things began to change. In the United States, for example, the number of Jews joining Zionist groups increased by almost tenfold. There were something like 1 million Jews in Zionist organizations by the end of the war. And the underlying emotion was really no longer love or a yearning for dignity. It was just pity and compassion as the Jews in Europe were being slaughtered. And remember that in the United States in the 1940s, half of all the Jews in the United States had been born in Eastern Europe. So they all were related one way or another, not all of them, but many, to people who were now being slaughtered. There's a tremendous feeling of solidarity and anxiety and trepidation. Here we see a pageant that was staged in New York City and San Francisco and at the Hollywood Bowl, in which famous Jewish actors assembled a large chorus and performed a combination of song and poetry and short plays to help raise consciousness about the plight of the Jews in Europe. So what happened then is that after the war was over and the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, and here we see the partition borders on this fundraising poster from late 1947, Jews throughout the world gave money very generously. It was a way to manifest their compassion, their pity, their anxiety, and also to some extent, frankly, their guilt. I don't have time to show this right now, but there's a fundraising, here you can see at least some images. The fundraising posters from 1948, basically there's an emergency, you must hurry, you must now give money to the Jews of Palestine. But it was very clear in the fundraising that Palestine was for other Jews, not for the well-to-do Jews, let's say, in North America or for the UK, very few of whom would move to the new Jewish state. So in this poster from the 1947 United Palestine Appeal, we see a man wearing a suit with a very nice, suit cuff and very clean fingernails, handing a trowel to a Holocaust survivor with broken fingernails and dirty hands, and his arms stretched out in a gesture of anguish as well as supplication, with the map of Palestine below them. The idea then was that it was a great emotional project to support the creation of a Jewish state for other people, that is, for the Holocaust survivors to found a new Jewish state. This is a particularly grim fundraising poster I found. Jewish blood flows again, but this time it's fighting blood. It's the blood of heroes, freedom blood, and really appealing to guilt. You are safe. Your family is safe. But what if the Jewish offenders are wiped out? What Nazi plan comes next? Give, give, give. And Jews gave. They gave $150 million that year. And this is 1948. That was a lot of money in 1948. It was about 10 times more than the American Cancer Society brought in that year. It was 4 times more than the entire American Red Cross brought in that year. It was a lot of money. American Jews were very generous. So I think the emotional transformation really was one then into a majority movement. Most Jews became Zionists to some extent, and their emotional norm was compassion and solidarity. So another emotional transformation would take place after Israel was created. And it began already in the 50s, when at least there were signs that American Jews were beginning to not only support Israel in a compassionate sense, but they were beginning to model their identities along the lines of Israel. And it'll be interesting for you in the audience, those of you in the UK, to talk about how similar or how different it was for Jews in the UK. Here we see a Jewish summer camp in the 50s where, people are dancing the Hora. Israeli folk dancing became very big already in the 50s. Synagogue gift shops began to sell Israeli products. So American Jews begin to kind of identify themselves through Israel. That's more than just compassion. There's something else going on. And the real bolt of pride in Israel and erotic pride came from this good-looking couple, Paul Newman and Eva Marie Saint, in the 1960 version of the best-selling novel by Leon Uris, Exodus, which was read by pretty much everybody of my generation and older. My students today have never heard of it, but it was hugely important because it's a novel that presented the Paul Newman character is supposed to be an Israeli with the name of Ari Ben Canaan, so very masculine kind of name. And this book filled Jewish readers with pride and no small amount of eros, given that his love interest is the beautiful blonde Gentile nurse Kitty Fremont, played by Eva Marie Saint. But the real transformation, from an emotional regime based on solidarity to something else, came during and after the 1967 war. Jews throughout the world were very concerned that Israel might be facing a second Holocaust on the eve of that war. Fundraising efforts were spectacular. People came together as they had not before for Israel. And then when Israel won the war, there was absolute adulation. After 1967, there was a huge transformation from solidarity to infatuation. To put it very simply, diaspora Jews fell in love with Israel. Here we see a comedy album that I grew up with. I don't know if any of you in the audience ever listened to this album. It was very popular. And I actually talked to there were these 2 men who produced the record, and one of them is still alive. It's like 95. And I talked to him about the record. It was a lot of fun. So it's called The Yiddish Are Coming. The Yiddish Are Coming. And almost all of the skits are about the war, about the 1967 war, and how noble and how heroic the Israelis are. And you can see that this whole cast, they're all wearing patches on their eye in imitation of the charismatic defense minister at the time, Moshe Dayan, who had an eye patch over one eye. So this was really falling in love with Israel. As a officer of the United Jewish Appeal Federation of New York said, Israel represented for me every idealistic impulse and vision I had. It was beautiful, egalitarian, social democratic, diverse, sexy. I was becoming aware of the Holocaust. This was but a moment after the Holocaust. Kibbutzim, it was just glorious. The fact that his statement is so disjointed and doesn't really make any sense is actually indicative of his emotional state. The beauty of the land, the political structure of the country, how sexy it is, good-looking men, good-looking women, Holocaust, everything is jumbled together. And there was this real erotic, romantic adulation of Israel from the 1960s for a number of decades. So as the great American rabbi Arthur Hertzberg said in the late 1970s, basically, if you're a Jew and you're intermarried and you don't know anything about the Jewish heritage, you can still be a leader in the Jewish community as long as you support Israel. But if you don't, even if you're an Orthodox Jew and you have all kinds of other Jewish, as it were, characteristics, you would be considered anathema. So Israel became the civil religion of American Jewry, and I think of Jews throughout the world. You think about how summer camps, Jewish day schools, synagogue life, everything centered around the state of Israel and the love of Israel. So we went from love to solidarity, and now we're back at love. Another good example of this comes in the 1970s when Israel became much less popular in the international community. And Israel was condemned by the United Nations in 1975. Zionism was condemned as a form of racism. And American Jews reacted to the condemnations of Israel. And they reacted to the 1973 war when the Syrian and Egyptian forces attacked the territories that Israel had occupied in 1967. American Jews became much more outspoken in their pride and their love of Israel. These buttons that I remember from my teenage years, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel must live. You had even more involvement in the 70s of, Israel became central to so many aspects of Jewish life. And I'm really eager to hear to what extent this was true or not true for the UK. Because I think there are parallels, but the UK may have been a little bit more subdued. I'm not sure. So what happens over the years? There have been attempts to keep that erotic, romantic adulation alive. The most recent example being the Birthright program that was founded about 25 years ago, in which young people go to Israel from all over the world for 10 days on a free trip. And you get all these young people, into a single place for 10 days, roaming around the country, and they are taught basically to love Israel. As one Birthright participant said, everything seems to have meaning everywhere. And here we see, I think they're at Nahal Zavitan here, so they're up in the Golan Heights. It's really very beautiful. So again, a kind of inculcation of love. I should just mention that one of the most interesting parts of these Birthright trips is traveling with IDF soldiers for a certain part of the trip. And there's no secret that there are the young women on the trips are often interested in having relations with the young men, the male soldiers. I don't know if it goes the other way, but I had a friend who was an IDF soldier on one of these trips, and he had a fiance. And when his commanding officer found out that he had a fiance, he called him a bizbuz hakzaot, a wasted allocation of financial resources, because he wasn't available for the young women. And in the 2000s, as criticism of Israel became more and more prominent on the world stage, and as Israel suffered through the second and more violent Palestinian Intifada, Israel became not less, but more and more central to American Jewish institutional life. The Hillel International, for example, the student foundations, the world over that deal with Jewish life on campus, they did not have a clear position on Zionism until the early 2000s. You could be an anti-Zionist and be welcome in Hillel, but not after 2002. Israel became central to its mission. That was new. There were always a few people who would criticize Israel, and they said they did so out of love, but not many. There was a small organization in the 1970s named Brera, or Choice, or Alternative. Young Jews at universities or just out of university, often from very Jewishly literate backgrounds. They spoke Hebrew, they lived in Israel, but they wanted Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. They wanted a Palestinian state created alongside of Israel. They were pretty much condemned by the American Jewish establishment. And then during the Lebanon War of the early 1980s, again, there were a few American mainstream voices that were critical of the bombardment of Beirut, like Philip Klutznick and Alexander Schindler. These were major mainstream American Jewish leaders who were willing to come out and criticize Israel over the Lebanon War. And well into the 21st century, there were certain guidelines in American Jewish life about, as long as you express love of Israel, then some element of criticism of Israel might be tolerated. So as long as, according to the head of Hillel International, you love Israel and have unequivocal support of Israel, then you could criticize it. And I even heard this recently from a rabbi in Toronto. It's okay to criticize Israel, but you have to criticize it from love. So the adulation and the love of the 1960s and 70s persisted in mainstream groups really until the 21st century. And there were certain red lines. So, for example, Hillel Foundation, declared in 2010 that if a person does not accept Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, if they don't believe in the state of Israel, then there's no room for them at Hillel. Or if someone supports the boycott movement, there's no room for them in Hillel, which is really supposed to be an organization to foster Jewish religious life. And yet a political dimension got more and more prominent in it in the 21st century. Some kinds of criticism of Israel were always considered okay. So if you were a Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi and you wanted to criticize how Israel did not support the non-Orthodox movements, that was okay. If you wanted to criticize how Israel discriminated against the non-Orthodox, that was okay. And what's the result of all this? So I was talking about mainstream Jewish organizations. Well, the fact is that by the 2010s, almost half of American Jews had been to Israel, and many were reading about Israel because of the internet. All kinds of news sources were available to them. Although most American Jews, and I think it's true for UK Jews as well, don't speak Hebrew, don't go to Israel very often. They're not really tied to the country. But I think it's arguable that more and more, English-speaking diaspora Jews got connected with Israel in some way. But how deep were the connections? How strong were the connections? That's the really interesting question, is that if you look at public opinion polling over the last 30 years or so, most Jews in diaspora are clearly attached to Israel in some way or form. They are, still today. But if you look at younger Jews under the age of, say, 35 or 40 or whatever, much less so, in the sense that instead of being very attached to Israel emotionally, they'll say they are somewhat attached to Israel. Most Jews are still attached, but just somewhat less. And I think this is probably more common among Jews today in the English-speaking world than complete disassociation with Israel. Although that happens, more common is a kind of emotional cooling. Israel is just not as important to them as it was to their parents or their grandparents. Now, there is an exception, which is Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews continue to feel strongly attached to Israel. unlike, say, what the Americans call Reform Jews, and the UK you would call, I guess, liberal Jews, or I guess liberal and Reform. It's confusing. My daughter is very involved in a Jewish community in Cardiff, which I think is Reform, which is more like conservative to me. And then she was involved in the liberal community in Bristol, which seemed to me more like Reform. So it's confusing. What's interesting, though, is if you look at qualitative research where people go and ask American Orthodox Jews why they're Zionists, the answers are not that different from what you would get from a non-Orthodox Jew. It's a place to live a Jewish life. It's a place to raise my kids Jewish. I don't have to worry about my kids marrying a non-Jew. I mean, very little of it is about religious commandments. Very little of it is about bringing on the age of the Messiah. It's an emotionally more intense version of the love that, you know, many American Jews feel for Israel. So orthodoxy is interesting. It's more a question of intensity rather than a completely different kind of emotional connection. But then came what I would call the third emotional transformation. So if the first transformation was from romantic love to solidarity, and the second transformation in the 60s and 70s was from solidarity to adulation, I think that last year there began a new solidarity, a new transformation from adulation to anguish. The word anguish is showing up over and over and over again over the last year and a half in writing in Jewish newspapers, Jewish blogs, and so forth about Israel. It first began with the 2022 election. Here we see Itamar Ben-Gvir, his Jewish Power Party, third largest, I think, in the not the third largest, sorry, but it won 13% of the vote. That's it. No, it wound up with 13 seats. That's it. Sorry. And how did people react? Well, you know, the mainstream American and Canadian Jewish groups expressed complete solidarity, and they claimed that the election was proof of Israel's robust democracy. So the fact that anti-democratic, you know, authoritarian parties won a fair number of seats to them was not an issue, but Israel was proving that it was democratic because it had a free election. But you began to see expressions of real unease and trepidation, even from people as mainstream as the former director of the Anti-Defamation League, who said, you know, there actually might be a situation where my love of Israel is conditional. I mean, if the Israeli government is going to go in this direction and become overtly racist and overtly authoritarian, you know, how can I support it? Mainstream centrist American Israelis like Hillel Halkin began to write about how the election of 2022 made them feel anguished. They were still connected to Israel, but they were very worried about its future. And here we have, again, three mainstream American Israelis, Daniel Gordis, Yossi Klein Halevi, and Maddie Friedman, who have written public letters basically saying that diaspora Jews must speak out against the attempts by the Israeli government to eviscerate the independence of the courts and to create a kind of a populist authoritarian state. These views became more and more common. They were spoken from the pulpits of American synagogues for the high holidays of 2023. Mainstream rabbis in New York pilloried the Israeli government. So this is where things were. I mean, a real expression of concern, anguish that Israel's civil strife might lead to a civil war, that the country might not become authoritarian so much as anarchic, like Lebanon, Thomas Friedman wrote. So there was real fear. And even the Orthodox Zionist groups that usually never condemn anything that happens in Israel condemned the rampage by West Bank settlers in a West Bank village where they torched houses and destroyed property. Why was this so important to at least North American Jews? Why do they care? Why should Israel be democratic? Why does it matter to them? They've really believed that Israel Israel says it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and they've believed it, and they've wanted it to be a democracy. These are North American values that are very important to, at least to American Jews, that a democratic state protects its minorities, just as the United States has or should protect its Jews. Democracy mattered. And so the idea of Israel not being democratic was really, I think, quite concerning to a lot of American Jews. Not all, not all. There were Jews who identify with the Republican Party who claimed that Israel basically has to go its own way and has to deal with its own problems, and that American Jews should not project their own liberal, desires onto a foreign situation. So Elliot Abrams, prominent conservative thinker, dismissed everything I've been saying as hysteria. It's not, anxiety. It's not trepidation. No, it's just hysteria. As he said that, Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, they might be fine. They might turn out to be fine, or maybe not. But the real issue is that Israel has enemies who are struggling to destroy it, and basically that's the only thing that matters. And so American Jews should not be complaining about the structure of the Israeli government. That's not what matters. So until October 7th, it looked like we were on the verge of a new era where diaspora Jews were becoming more fissured and more divided in their feelings about Israel. I felt this over and over again in my talks in synagogues, that the old hegemonic feeling rules, only speaking about Israel from love, the centrality of Israel in Jewish life, all of these things were being not rejected, but questioned in new ways. And it seemed like we were on the eve of a new era, of a more critical engagement with Israel, maybe a more dialogic relationship with Israel, although some Jews might just, walk away altogether. And it might be a return to the way things were before 1967, where, most American Jews had some solidarity with Israel, but it was not the center of their life. It was not the center of their Jewish life. And, it seemed like a more complicated emotional palette, not just adulation, but also anger, frustration, and as I've said, really key, anguish, but along with new forms of resolve and commitment to not walk away from Israel, but to try to improve things. And that's where we were until October 7th. That is, we went from a kind of innocent adulation to a much more complicated sense of engagement and anguish to see Israel filled with civil strife, on the verge of civil war. And then came October 7th. And the word anguish is showing up all over the place now in the Jewish public sphere, but in a very different way, because this is not civil strife. There's nothing more frightening, by the way, to a society than civil war. Thomas Hobbes wrote this in Leviathan almost 400 years ago. And as horrible as October 7th was, there is a kind of internal rallying that an attack by an external enemy can bring. And we've seen how, the overwhelming majority of diaspora Jews have, rallied on behalf of Israel since the October 7th massacre by Hamas. And of course, within the state of Israel, there has been a rallying on a kind of, rallying to the flag, and that the people who were leading the protest movements in Israel, protesting every week against the government's judicial overhaul, were now leading the campaigns to get the supplies, for example, to the troops and to move troops to the front and so forth. But in a weird way, Israel now is experiencing a kind of return to a sense of grief and vulnerability and fear from a previous era. For example, here we have the former head of the Eshkol Regional Council, who tattooed the date, August 7th, on his arm in what is obviously a replication of an Auschwitz tattoo. That's a very meaningful statement and a very meaningful image, that they're kind of, and the language of October 7th and ever since has been the language of the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, another pogrom, never again. All this language associated with the Jewish past is coming back, which really challenges a lot of aspects of Zionism, which was a movement designed to give Jews a sense of dignity and honor, and security. But once again, as we saw earlier, huge levels of Jewish solidarity outside of Israel, fundraising. American Jewish groups have already raised $500 million for Israel, which is a lot. The problem, and then just as I'm ending in just about 1 minute, there's also a very profound sense of betrayal, particularly among Jews on the left, who had opposed Israel's occupation of the West Bank. They'd opposed Israel's control over Gaza. They had desired Palestinian statehood. And Jewish leftists have felt betrayed by many of the more extreme people on the American left who have justified or even celebrated what Hamas did. So I think that now throughout the Jewish world, there's a sense of anguish, vulnerability, worry, anxiety that is greater even than what we had in the 1970s. And the problem, though, is that let's not, I'm sorry to end on a somewhat even more depressing note, but let's not delude ourselves that the divisions within Israel will disappear because of the solidarity that this war engendered. The divisions within Israel are very real, and they won't go away after the war. And usually in world history, when a divided country goes to war, there is a temporary healing of divisions, and then after the war is over, the divisions come back in a much stronger form. So again, from, one kind of love to solidarity, from solidarity to kind of innocent, giddy infatuation and adulation, from adulation to anguish, whether it's about the internal troubles that Israel is experiencing, or anguish about now the Hamas massacre, the 1,300 slaughtered Israelis, and then this ongoing war with Hamas, which has no end in sight, and no one knows, how many people on either side are going to be killed. So this is a moment of emotional turmoil. And I haven't even talked about what's happening outside of the Jewish world, but that we can talk about during the question and answer period. So with that, I'll stop. It's been 47 minutes, so I'll stop and be very happy to take your questions. Let me just stop my share and make sure I've got my, there you go. I see everybody. Hello, everybody. Oh,
thank you so much. Thank you, Derek, for a really engaging talk, a whistle-stop tour through your book and various other writings, and for raising lots of intriguing, important questions that have so many resonances in the here and now. I've had a couple of questions come through to me, but please do feel free to post your questions in the chat, or if you would like, put your hand up and I'm happy to put those to Derek. I'm going to start off with a question of my own, if that's allowed. And it was a question that occurred to me as you were talking about the much earlier American fundraising drives, particularly around 48 and then 67. And of course, that it's unsurprising, but still worth noting that the various turning points that you noted were all around wars, that these are the kind of key turning points that create these shifts in diaspora Jews' relationship with Israel. And this phenomenon of fundraising drives, of course, made me think immediately about the kinds of fundraising drives that are happening now to support Magen David Adom and to support various other organizations, NGOs and so on in Israel. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit more about what you see being the emotions underpinning those, perhaps because it's present, it feels so much more multi-layered and complicated.
Right.
But because of all these internal cleavages and external cleavages, I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, again, in some ways, they're playing to an old script. It's a script that was written in 47, 48. Actually, come to think of it, the script was written even earlier. You know when the script was written? It was written after World War I. There was massive destruction of Jewish communities in Eastern Europe in World War I, and there were close to 100,000 or as many as 100,000 Jews were slaughtered in Ukraine after the war. And there were fundraising campaigns out of the United States in the 20s that used fundraising posters that shamelessly appealed to guilt, with pictures of tired, hungry Jewish people and saying, how long will you let her go hungry? Or pictures of Jewish graveyards and descriptions of Jews committing suicide because they're so devastated by war and economic limited opportunity. So I think that invocation of both solidarity and guilt actually goes back to the 1920s. And then it came back in a big way right after the Holocaust, 1946. Then came the fundraising connected with Israel, 48, and the same thing in 67 and 73 and 82 and so on. So in a way, what's happening now is a repetition of a very old script of Jewish people in need. The difference is there is a sense of vulnerability, weakness that in some levels we haven't seen since 1973. Israel was the victim of a surprise attack in 1973. This, and I wasn't around, I was around in 1973, but I wasn't a professional historian then. I think that this time around, the ferocity and the barbarism of Hamas's attacks was especially unnerving, both to people in the state of Israel and to Jews throughout the world. And so the sense that we are not just in another crisis like 67 or 73, but that we've gone back to 1941 or 1903, the world of the Kishinev pogrom, I think that's adding a particular note of anguish, passion, desperation to the fundraising. I mean, to raise $500 million in 2 weeks is a lot of money. So, I mentioned that they raised 150 million over a year in 1948. So that's the equivalent of 1.5 billion today. American Jews have raised 1/3 of that in 2 weeks. It's an incredible outpouring. And I think something like 80 million of it has come from New York City alone. It's just amazing. And it's not just the amount of money. It's how many people are involved in this. And that sense of obligation, of commitment, almost a frenzy of activity. I think in some ways this is even more desperate than what happened in 1973. It's the same kind of emotional contagion, very powerful. And so we're living through it right now.
Let me pose to you a question from the chat. Ivan asks, how does the Jewish community deal with the historic fact that Palestine was Arab before the League of Nations imposed the State of Israel?
The question is, how does the Jewish community deal with the fact that it was an Arab country?
The fact that Palestine was Arab before the League of Nations.
Yeah, there's all kinds of justifications and rationalizations, and it's very hard to tell when those rationalizations or justifications are sincere and when they're expedient. I think they're usually sincere. I've done a lot of work on the way that Jews throughout the world reacted to the Balfour Declaration and then Britain's occupation of Palestine, so 1918, 1919. And there is a very strong sense in the Jewish world that the Balfour Declaration is part of a whole era of Wilsonian national self-determination, that everybody will get their state, that the empires will relax their grip, and that Jews will have their state. Now, that's interesting, given that, of course, there are people living in Palestine. There's 500,000 Arabs living in Palestine, and very few of them would be at all happy about a Jewish national home. So then they come up with arguments that the Palestinians really aren't Palestinian, that they are, quote, Syrian. They don't really deal directly with the Palestinian newspapers and books and educational system from the time in which Palestine was specifically singled out from Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, to answer Rachel Green's question, that there were, newspapers called Philistine, The Roman Catholic Patriarchate had a concept of Palestine. There were textbooks that spoke of our homeland, Palestine. I think Jews simply, for the most part, ignored it with the belief that the Arabs, as they were called, all Arabs were seen as kind of interchangeable, would have their Syrian or their Arabian or whatever homelands, and the Jews would have theirs. And so it was a way of squaring the circle and justifying their beliefs. And the fact is, when people believe in something and desire it, they find a way to justify it emotionally. So, and I think this continues to this day, that on all sides of this conflict, people are very good at ignoring evidence that does not support their particular point of view. And this is, of course, true in the pro-Palestinian community as well. There's all kinds of things that people say that are just simply either not true at all or only partly true, because again, emotion really trumps everything else. And the emotional attachments to the land of Israel and to Zionism have been extremely strong. And so then people rationalize or emotionalize, whatever the word is, and they find a way to justify their feelings. Anyway.
There's a very striking juxtaposition between the ending of your answer, which is, about emotions, and the fact that Ivan's question points to the historic fact, and it just points to the ways in which evidence, as you say, is marshaled in very particular ways, often in very partial ways, by both sides, or all sides,
all sides,
not binary.
I have heard so many times in my career, the problem is that people don't know the facts. And if you give them the facts, they will then agree with whoever it is I'm talking to. Well, whose facts? Whose facts? There's all kinds of facts, some of which are quite helpful in justifying the Zionist cause, some of which are extremely troubling for the Zionist cause. And the same thing is, of course, true for the Palestinians. So facts are only what you make of them. There are facts, by the way. I do believe in truth. Things really happen or don't. But selective use of facts is ubiquitous. Anyway, other questions?
And a difficult complexity to deal with in the public arena, or to convey in the public arena.
Right.
I'm going to go back to a very early question that is relating to the present moment and not directly to your talk, but we can go back to some other questions after that. Jay asked, why do you think 30-some presidents of American universities are reluctant to speak against anti-Jewish sentiments of pro-Palestinian students who are calling for violence against Jews?
Well, that question's a bit unfair because it's not true. What's happened is that the way that American university presidents have responded to the crisis has varied enormously. Some university presidents have been more forthright, some have been less so. But I think there is a basic tension in the heart of a liberally oriented American university, which is, on the one hand, a commitment to progressive causes. Places like Harvard, places like Oberlin College or whatever, these places are very much imbued with progressive political values. And so one tends to support the underdog, and Palestinians are an occupied people, and Muslims in America have been the victims of a lot of discrimination. And so there's kind of a desire to, or kind of a, what's the word, baseline or presumptive desire to sympathize with them. On the other hand, anti-Semitism is despicable. And I don't think that my university president was being disingenuous when she condemned it, which she did in her second and third statements, although not clearly, actually a little bit in her first, but more in her second and third. So there's a tension then between progressive values, and then what do you do when people, let's say, endorse something really horrible like the massacre, the Hamas massacre, in the names of the freedom for the wretched of the earth, for the colonized people of the earth. It presents progressives with a contradiction. And my only, I think, more comforting answer to this is that what they say doesn't really matter. And I'm really interested in why people both within and outside the universities have placed so much stock in the statements, whether they've been good statements or not very good statements. Because the students at Harvard, for example, do you think they listen to what the president of Harvard has to say? I mean, it has no effect on them whatsoever. In some ways, all she did is goad the pro-Palestinian students. And so I'm really interested in the significance of these statements. The hostility to Israel is so pervasive and it's so deep-seated. This is not something that a college president can just make disappear by making a statement. This reflects massive political and demographic changes in the United States. And by the way, the universities are only the most vocal, as it were, manifestations of these political changes that are happening throughout the United States. So I don't think the university presidents themselves really matter all that much. What's the next question?
Eugene raises the question of how we define terrorism. So he says 20th century fundraising for Irish nationalists from the US was seen in the UK as supporting terrorism, whereas, of course, for some Irish seeking liberation, this would be perceived very differently.
Right.
And he asks how we see this really in the context of what's happening now.
Well, that's the problem, is that the UK government and the US government have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, and I think rightly so. I mean, I'd like to believe that there is a formal definition and not simply this shouldn't simply be relative, like if you happen to support the cause, then you don't call them terrorists. In my view, the fact that Hamas is not committed to a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, short of Israel's utter dismantlement, to me, this qualifies, as it were, the delegitimization of Hamas. The Palestine Authority, for all of its flaws, at least formally recognizes the state of Israel. So in my view, there's a difference between organizations that at least have an ideal of coexistence and ones that have an ideal of destruction. And for that reason, it makes sense to me that Hamas is designated the way it is, although I have colleagues who believe that Hamas moderated in recent years and they have their evidence. I'm not really convinced by it, but there are people who say it. I think the overwhelming evidence would suggest that Hamas is being justly delegitimized in the international arena, and the actions of October 7th, in my opinion, confirm that.
So another difficult question that's certainly been coming up a lot in public discourse. Kenneth raises the question of Israel being a colonial state, or this description of Israel as settler colonial. What's your view on that?
It's a funny thing. I've spent 20 years writing about this because a lot of scholars write about Zionism being a product of the era of colonialism. Theodor Herzl was proud to call Zionism colonial. He said it explicitly, as did Chaim Weizmann. These people were proud to be connected with the British Empire or the German Empire. But there's lots of aspects of Zionism that don't fit colonialism. And I was at an event recently where Palestinian speakers were talking about Israel as colonial. And at one point I said, you know what? I've been arguing against this for 20 years. I'm going to stop now. And I'm going to say, let's just say for a minute that Israel's colonial. Okay. Now what? In other words, so what? It's colonial. So is the United States. The United States is a settler colonial state. It is. A bunch of people came from somewhere else, settled on the territory, and expropriated the native people. So is Canada. So is Australia. So is New Zealand. Are we going to make the United States disappear? Is Canada going to disappear? I mean, what are we going to do? Is it going to be like Algeria, where the French-speaking settlers just went off to France? No, the Israelis aren't going to leave. They're not going to go anywhere. Is it going to be like South Africa, where they had a regime change? Well, in South Africa, you had a leader of a anti-colonial movement who was against the killing of civilians and who asserted over and over again that the white settlers had every reason to be there. I haven't heard that coming from Hamas. In other words, even if we accept this notion, which I don't fully accept, but even if we did, it doesn't solve anything. The fact is, my Palestinian interlocutors and I could all agree, Israel's not going anywhere. The Jews aren't going anywhere. Palestinians aren't going anywhere. So we have to come up with a solution. And in a way, I kind of undercut the argument. they didn't know what to respond because they just want to shout about how Israel's a colonial state. I'm beginning to realize there's no point engaging with this anymore. Anyway.
My sense is that part of the answer is also just in your comment that they're shouting about it. It seems to me that it's part of this very binary worldview that is so common nowadays on Twitter and elsewhere. It's binary. You're either oppressor or oppressed. It's about decolonization. It's about anti-racism. And Israel's got to fit in one or the other, so it must be the colonial oppressor.
Well, it's a funny thing. I tell my students that nationalism is the desire to be oppressed by your own people. Of course, this is so unhelpful. And the other issue is that in American universities, at least, the rejection of civility. Civility is considered to be the tool of the oppressor. What I learned in Oxford is that civility is actually a form of empowerment, because you can be really nasty to people while being polite, as you all know, those of you in the UK. I mean, they'd rather kill you than be rude to you, right, in the UK. And I found that when you don't shout at people, you don't get the fear threat response. Your adrenal glands don't start secreting. You don't start to sweat, and your heartbeat doesn't go up. In other words, you can actually have a conversation, as the result of which you may actually change your mind. So I would think that if pro-Palestinian students really wanted to get their point across, they'd be incredibly polite, not out of being nice. I learned that at Oxford, that being civil and being nice are not the same thing. And I really liked it. I was able to have very tough conversations with people precisely because we weren't yelling at each other. But in the States, they call that hypocritical. I call it simply the way that human beings can get along. But anyway.
There have been lots of different questions, both to me and in the chat. And given the time, I think I'm going to start wrapping it up. But there was one final question that I'm going to pose, which is really turning the lens. And I know that this has not been the subject of your book, but perhaps it's an interesting final point to look at. And he asks, what is the feeling of Israelis towards American Jews today?
Well, Israelis tend to like whoever is nice to them. And the fact that American Jews are raising lots of money and expressing solidarity for Israel makes them feel engaged with. I can only say that my friends in Israel, I have lots of close friends. For a long time now, they have cherished having their American and other diaspora friends come because they feel isolated. During the whole period of the judicial demonstrations, they wanted us to come and to come to the demonstrations and to show solidarity. And it wasn't just about money. It was also about an emotional sense of connection. And the fact that I've been in touch with my friends and of course they feel very isolated. And so it's not just a material connection. They feel very cut off, and they're very frightened for good reason. So this is why I mentioned towards the end of my comments that although some diaspora Jews may walk away from Israel if the country becomes, increasingly chauvinist and authoritarian, I think more and more diaspora Jews will become more engaged in a critical way, supporting those aspects of the Israeli state that they find admirable. And at least my friends who are on what I would call this sort of responsible left, my friends want that. They want us to be engaged. And I like being engaged because I care very deeply about the country. It's a lot more than just wanting our money. They also, and it's not just that they want our love, they want us to be engaged. And that's what I hope everyone here will do.
Well, thank you. So many more questions and thoughts, but we will have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid, because of time. Thank you so much again, Derek, for such an engaging and sober-minded talk about emotions on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. And a reminder, I'll go on. Did you want to jump in and say something?
Well, there was just one about the abducted, and I just want to say that for all of you who care about the abducted in Israel, I know that in the United States, I've got a friend whose son was kidnapped. We're writing to our Congress representatives. In Canada, I'm writing to my MP and to the government. And, I don't know what can help, but just to do whatever you can to try to pressure, whatever pressure can be put to redeem the captives, which is, after all, a very important Jewish religious commandment. And also, not that I'm a shill for anybody, but the kibbutzim that were destroyed, they have funds. You can give money to the various kibbutzim that were destroyed so they can be rebuilt. I'm just saying these are practical things that people can do. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you for drawing attention to that message that just came through. And I would be happy if people would like to send through a list of links. Perhaps, Derek, you could send me some that you're aware of when we send out the recording after this talk. So thanks very much for drawing attention to that. So just to say thank you very much again for your time. Reminder, I put a copy of the link where you can buy a copy of Professor Penslar's most recent book with a nice discount. And a reminder of our next event, which is also was planned a long time ago, but is also very timely. Professor Emily Griebel will be coming to talk to us about Jews and Muslims in Sarajevo and the complicated relationships between them during the Nazi period in the 1930s and 40s. That's going to be in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 15th of November at 7 p.m. UK time. So thank you all again for joining us. Thank you again, Derek. Keep safe and well, everyone.
Stay well. Sei gesund. Bye.